And so this month, Paul Stoffels is going to be, today, he'll be presenting Composting, Building Your Garden from the Ground Up. And Paul is a University of Illinois Extension Master Gardener. He's been one since 1994. He won the State Outstanding Master Gardener Award in 2000. He has done horticulture coursework at College of DuPage. He has been a flower and vegetable show judge, and he's an active member of Suburban Garden Club and the Hawthorne Garden Club of Glen Ellen. And then with the Extension Master Gardener Program, Paul's an active member of the Speakers Bureau. He's volunteered at Master Gardener help desks at local garden centers and is a co-team leader at our community at the Extension Community Garden Project in Naperville. And Paul's areas of interest are in gardening, including vegetables, annuals, and seed starting. And Paul, you are muted right now. Here, I'll unmute you. There you go.
Hello, can everybody hear me and see me?
I can hear you.
Okay, I hope the glare off my 6 head isn't too bad. I had a 4 head to begin with. Now I've got a 6 head with the virus. Never mind. Welcome. Thank you for having me. Let's see if I can click on share screen. Does this show? I want screen 1. Let's try. Are you seeing my composting demonstration? Okay, so here we're here to talk about composting this evening. Let's see if I can. Why is the page down button not working? Did that change? Okay, so the Illinois Extension is part of the College of Agricultural and Consumer Environmental Sciences of the University of Illinois. And our goal is to spread fact-based information, and that's why we have help desk and the various newsletters and things like that to help residents of DuPage County and the surrounding area with fact-based information about horticultural projects. So here tonight we're just to talk about composting. So what is composting? And really it's basically the rotting process. It's the natural process of decomposition and recycling of organic material, and it creates a humus-rich soil amendment. So it's basically the natural decomposition of all the plant material that's out there. Yell at me if I'm going too fast or too slow, or is the volume acceptable? Okay, good. So as an engineer, we learn to do PowerPoint presentations. We tell you what we're going to tell you, then we tell you what we told you. So we're going to go over to some of these topics tonight. One of the things is you can compost items instead of throwing them in the garbage. And if possible, you know, we all know the problems we have with the filling up of the land waste facilities. So if you can compost something and keep it at home instead of putting it in the yard, in the landscape facilities, we encourage it. So some of the benefits of composting. It improves soil structure and texture. It helps with aerating the soil. We all know that plants take in carbon dioxide through the leaves, but they also use oxygen underneath the soil level. So you want aeration in the soil. It can be used to help with erosion control, and it's kind of a lightweight, mild fertilizer, so it can help soil fertility and stimulate healthy root development. So what does it take to compost? And it really takes 2 things. It takes brown material, which is carbon. That's the leaves and dried leaves we've got, shredded sticks, things like that. And green material, nitrogen. Those are the 2 components that make up compost. Because this ultimately will be used in your own garden, we hope, exclude seed heads or diseased plants. Those are the ones that are acceptable to send off to yard waste facilities, try to send them to yard waste facilities. They can compost a little more effectively than we are, and their composting sites get the material hot enough to get rid of the seed heads and make them less viable. In addition, there are other things you don't really want to put in your compost, and it's obvious. You don't want to attract the wrong clientele to be rummaging through your compost pile. That includes meat scraps, bones, fatty substances, things that will attract rodents and chipmunks and squirrels. No animal litter. That's not something to put in there. And be sure to follow local regulations or building codes. I don't know the regulations for all the locations around the county, but there are some cities and areas that say you shouldn't have a compost pile within X number of feet of lot line X, or the rear lot line, or the side lot line, or various things. There, you know, it's really not watched too strongly, but there may be, in order to preserve peace with neighbors, indications that you shouldn't have the compost pile right up against your neighbor's yard. It helps when you're building a compost pile to layer the green and brown material. That will help the microorganisms and larger insects and fauna to mix the two together. Like I remember, you want to have kind of about an even amount of green material and brown material. And if you have the opportunity to mix it, to layer it when you build it, that may not be possible in all situations, because this time of year you may have a lot of green material, and in the fall you may have a lot of brown material. But recommendations are made to be broken, but we'll go through them and explain why they're the recommendations. Nature helps. So a lot of what is happening with composting is the natural decomposition. Excuse me. I get a dry throat every once in a while. So worms, little, the roly-polies and other bacteria in the soil is what creates the decomposition process. Add oxygen, water, and heat, and the compost pile will start to compost. Where was I going with this? Turning the compost will speed up the process. So if you are not able to layer it, we'll get into this a little further in the presentation. You'll see multiple bin compost piles, and that's a way to turn it. Turn it is actually a way to add oxygen and air into the mix, so it creates an aerobic rather than an anaerobic composting, and also will mix it so that the material can get in contact, and the brown and the green material can get together. Food scraps are nitrogen. So if you're doing picking beans, the bush beans that I snap for my wife, she goes out and picks them, I snap them, she preserves them. The ends go in the compost pile. Carrot peelings, the outside of beets, the tops of the carrots, even rhubarb leaves. Remember, when this compost, the rhubarb leaves, everyone says, well, can you put them into the compost pile? They're decomposed over the time, and then they get absorbed as nutrients by the plants. So rhubarb leaves are fine, able to go in there as well if you ever get that question. So coffee grounds, yes. I'm not sure if coffee grounds fall into the green or brown material, but you're not going to have enough to overwhelm one or the other. So that's fine. But again, keep the things, the fatty, the meaty, the bones out of your compost pile that will attract the raccoons and other rodents. Worms are okay. You see them in there. They're helping to mix the material up and do that. This is fairly completed compost, so this looks okay. Can I get back to building the compost pile a little bit? Don't feel you have to clean the plants of soil when you're putting them in the compost pile. A lot of the microorganisms and the bacteria that will start the composting are in the soil on the roots of the weeds that you're pulling up. And as long as you don't have active seed heads, put that in the compost pile. You're going to add it back to your yard, so you're not losing the soil. But that's where the organisms that start the composting come from. One thing to say is, I don't know if people remember, 5, 10, 15 years ago, there was these boxes of compost starter, this material that you would sprinkle into the compost pile. That isn't necessary. If you have the dirt on the roots and things like that you add, that's where you get the stuff to start the process. You don't need to add a compost starter material. Don't spend your money on that. It's not required. Does that make sense? Location. Shady, yeah, maybe. Sheltered spot, close to kitchen or gardens. Doesn't have to be close to the kitchen or garden. It should be a place where you can get the plant material from your yard put into the pile. If you look at this picture, you will notice that, I don't know if you can see it, the sides are covered with chicken wire, and that's a way to keep the stuff from falling out the sides. Notice, however, that it is up against the house. That is not a good choice. Think of what's happening in your compost pile. Your compost pile is decomposing things. If you leave it against the house, you're eventually going to have those organisms in the pile try to decompose your house. So please do not have it against a wooden fence or some sort of house or a shed. Try to keep it away from a structure, because you don't want, excuse me, you don't want the materials to attack the shed or the house. Size of the bin. It's recommended about a cubic yard, about 3 to 4 foot on the side, or about a, diameter. That's about the size for an average homeowner. All types of bins. You can buy them pre-made, you can build your own. We'll go through some of the, there are single bins. You can make it out of a wire frame. You can buy the plastic one. You can make it out of cinder blocks. You can make it out of wood. The black plastic one on the bottom left of the screen, it's supposedly, it's so easy to scoop out the stuff from the bottom by sliding this little front panel up. It's not as easy as they say. Double bins, again, pre-made or you can make your own. This is my compost pile. I've got a compost fork to help do things, to mix stuff. Notice that when I've done the 2-bin process here in my house, even though I've tried, you can see the metal stake on the front of the front edge of the wings of the compost pile. The sides have sagged. They've leaned away. So this might happen to your compost pile, And so I don't know if you can see my cursor, these slots that the wooden bars go into that cover the front, if you can make that a deeper slot than just a narrow one, when these sides sag out, these front boards to cover and keep the material in will have a tendency to stay in place better than, this is probably a 20-year-old bin. So it's served me well. Are there any questions so far? I've been doing a lot of talking and I don't know if there are any questions. Okay. Then one of us is doing something wrong. Triple bins. Again, you can have any number of style of bins, but the reason to have multiple bins, I've got a 2-bin system, and yes, they both get filled up in the fall with yard waste, but they're designed so that you've got an empty space to the left or the right of the bin. And if you are going to be an active composter by actively turning the pile to mix it and aerate it, by having an empty spot to put things in and the front slats on the bins that can come out so you can scoop straight and not have to scoop over a wall, it makes it easier to move the components from one bin to the next. Instead of trying to turn it on itself, you move it into an empty bin, and it makes the mixing a lot more easy to do. Again, there are all sorts of shapes and sizes. Here's a listing, a couple of pictures of various different things. The tumblers, yes, you can buy a tumbler. That's to help do the mixing. I don't know that, I've never really tried a tumbler, so I don't know how effectively they are. I suspect that with the holes in the side to possibly do a little bit of air, you might have stuff falling out. You may want to have a tarp or something underneath it. Slide the tarp under and then slide it out if you dump the compost out, and that way you can get the compost that's not piling up on the ground underneath the tumbler.
Oh, we actually do have a question.
Yes.
So someone in chat said, I know you said no pet waste, but is manure okay?
Yeah, horse manure, maybe chicken manure. They're not something I would recommend putting in the compost bin. You want to get that sort of stuff that's already composted. Don't necessarily apply manure or whatnot straight to your plants until it's cooled off. If you're going to do that, I would suggest that you try to separate your yard waste from the manures. I suspect a very small amount of manure would be fine, but if you've got a large pile, separate them, compost them separately, if that makes sense.
That's it.
You can make a compost bin out of most anything: pallets, cinder blocks, plastic. Here's more cinder blocks. Air circulation helps, and that's what you want to do, is get air circulation, which is why grass clippings. Let's bring up the topic of grass clippings. A large pile of grass clippings dumped into a bin by itself will mat down and doesn't let air and oxygen in there, and that's when you get the stinky smell of grass clippings decomposing. What you're looking for is an aerobic composting, an aerobic decomposition, rather than anaerobic. Anaerobic is when something is without oxygen, aerobic is with oxygen, and that's why the turning will help add air to the pile. Again, the pallet underneath here may look like a good idea, but after time, the compost is going to fall in between the slots of the pallets. I think it's probably looks great to begin with, but you're going to have problems with this you know, a year or two down the road when you've got the compost that's already got inside the pellet. Probably more effort than it's worth. The air, the tubes to get air in there are probably not providing enough oxygen in the middle of the pile to make it worthwhile. I wouldn't necessarily try to go to this effort of putting these perforated PVC tubes in there. So how about what about some of the uses of compost? We'll cover these things. Mulch versus compost. Mulch is any material. It could be wood chips, it could be paper, shredded yard clippings, even rocks that cover the soil and are there to help with the soil evaporation, prevent weed growth, insulate plants from extreme temperatures and change and things like that. Compost can be a form of mulch. You can use compost as a mulch, as a top cover. And I've done that myself. Is remember, the stuff you've put in there don't have the weed seeds. So it being on top, as long as it's composted, it's not a strong, heavy, you know, it's not like fresh manure. It's a very lightweight fertilizer component. It will provide a little bit of fertilizer, but it's a weed-free barrier that can cover the soil and prevent weed germination from the soil. So it can do the benefit of that. It also can help keep soil cooler in the summer. You don't want to put it on too early in the season because it keeps the soil wetter and moister. If you put it on early spring, your soil is not going to dry out and you won't be able to plant into it. It's often easier, you know, we recommend composting at home to take care of our own plant materials, but yes, you can buy it by the truck if you want. You can find yourself a bunch of college students to help you. And this is an example of where it's used as a mulch, and you can see how it improves the look of the yard when it's used as a mulch. You can sift and use as a seed starter. Yes, you can, but probably a potting mix, a Miracle Grow, a Master Garden, you know, the Schultz's bag that you get in Menards or Home Depot is probably the best, you know, is a better seed starting mix for starting seeds at home rather than trying to go through the effort of using your compost. Again, do as I say, not as I do. You could, it's probably not worth the effort. You can use it as potting soil. Now this is a little more reasonable. Again, you can mix it in. You can mix it in with other potting soil, and now this will add aeration. It will add the organisms to help stimulate root growth in your pots, that sort of stuff. Probably in this case, because it came from outside and may have critters in it, you may want to use it more for potting soil in an outdoor plant on a pot or a planter outside on a patio rather than inside, because you wouldn't want to necessarily bring in worms or, you know, the roly-polies and that sort of stuff into your home. Does that make sense? It's a great way to recycle. Notice the dated 1960s clothing. So it's not rocket science, it's rot science. The one thing as I go through here that I didn't talk to you about is adding water. Water is one of those things that all organisms need, and your compost pile will do better if you add water to it. So that's why you don't necessarily need a cover. Let the rain add to it. When I'm watering my garden, I spray over onto the compost pile. and let it get soaked. People say it should be, excuse me, about the amount of water in it as a wrung out sponge. Well, cover it with water. The water's going to drain out the bottom anyway, so don't worry about whether it's too wet or too dry. It will get to the point of what's the right amount of water in the pile if you overwater it.
Well, I've got a couple of questions. So
Yes.
one was in chat, can you use just compost in a pot, or is it too heavy?
No, you can use just compost in the pot. That would be fine. Again, I'm trying to be polite here. I'm not so sure about what else is in it with the animal things, the bugs and the centipedes and the worms. So if you're going to use it indoors, make sure you look through it pretty good and don't bring things into indoors that you don't want to. But, straight compost outside, as long as it's composted, that'll be fine, because it's now not a hot material. It's not, like fresh manure. It will be, it's just like any other potting mix. Sure, that would be great.
Then I had a question. You had talked about using compost as mulch, but not spreading it on too early in the season. So what time of the year would you recommend spreading it as mulch?
Probably late May. Again, think of what a mulch does. A mulch conserves moisture. So after you've got the garden planted, then you can add the compost as a mulch to there. You don't want to mulch your garden so soon that it keeps the spring rains from evaporating and drying out to the point where you can't get into the garden, and every time you're stepping into it, you're creating concrete blocks.
Okay, thank you.
So again, the University of Illinois Extension is here to answer your questions. I've gone through this a little quicker than I normally do. So are there any other questions? Again, keep it away from your house. You don't want to decompose the siding of your house. I guess someone has thought this was creative and planted a something in the compost bin. So you can see it works just like potting soil here, so don't worry about that.
And we do have another question. So as you think of your questions, please put them into chat, and then we'll give them to Paul. So I've got, how do you know when your compost is done enough to mulch with?
It will almost look like soil. So if you can see and discern and figure out what the plant material was when you put it into the pile, if it's still able to be, this was a grass clipping or this was a leaf or something, it's not done. It'll have decomposed to the point where you won't be able to recognize what you're using. It'll look like dirt or soil that's just a kind of a potting soil type thing.
And the next one is, can you go over the yard waste law? And you might need to provide a little bit more information about what you're asking. Go ahead and unmute you. Jan, I unmuted you if you want to kind of clarify what you're asking about.
Well, I think it's the state of Illinois does not want yard waste or tree trimmings or all that kind of stuff to go into the landfill. And some things we can use in our compost, but some things are maybe too coarse and, like branches and also weeds with seeds that we don't want to put in the compost. So what is the yard waste law?
Well, again, yes, yard waste law is to keep it out of landfills that are for home refuse rather than yard waste facilities. So, in my neighborhood, we've got 3 trucks that go go around each day on trash day. There's the one that comes early in the morning at 6 o'clock every morning, every Tuesday morning like clockwork. I know it's 6 o'clock because I hear the garbage truck out there. That's for your home waste, the stuff that goes into a landfill. The second is the recycling for your aluminum cans and plastics and bottles and whatnot. And the third is the large yard waste bags that you put out there, basically the 30-gallon paper bags. So those materials, the seed heads and whatnot, would go in the third category. They would go out and they would be commingled with other trees and leaves and shredded branches and things like that, and brought to a composting facility where they've got these big, long rows of piles that are about 10 feet high, and these massive machines that drive down the length of them and turn them and mix them. You were talking about the sticks and whatnot. So if you think about a compost pile as a piece of hard candy, you've got a leaf that you want to put in the compost pile. The amount of edge space, the amount of the ability for it to compost faster is like if you put a piece of candy in your mouth and you chew it. It's going to dissolve quicker with the smaller the pieces are. So yes, you can put shredded tree limbs and whatnot in your pile. The wood, think of a tree that falls in the forest. That's composting. The trees that fall in the forest are there for many, many years because they're not shredded up and made smaller or finer. If you can, as you pick up your leaves, pick them up with a lawnmower and bag them and then put them in the compost pile. The shredding or the tearing of the leaves is like making the candy in your mouth smaller and dissolve faster. So,
Well, the thing is, if you have a yard where you can compost leaves and grass, and they're very good in the compost pile, or buried in the ground in a
the Trudy Temple method, where you dig a hole and throw things into your garden and then cover it with soil. Yes.
Right. But the thing is, here where I live, it's pretty hard. I live in a community, a retirement community, and I just was looking for what the law is, because they don't seem to know that you're not supposed to put yard waste in the regular trash. And we have personnel changes every now and then, and I just don't think they know it, and I need the data. I need the law. I need to...
Well, I don't know the specific law. I think we all know that yard waste is supposed to be separated from regular waste, and that's been pretty clear through for many years, and that's why they have separate collection groups. Now yes,
Right.
it may be a little bit...
I know, but here they instructed us to put our yard waste in the trash, and I'm trying to get that corrected. So I need, I know, but they don't know. So I need to find out.
I don't really know the answer to what the yard waste law, the particular code is.
Okay, I'll try to find out.
Yeah, I mean, probably in a quick internet search, I've got too many screens up in front of me to try to do it at the moment.
Okay, thank you anyway.
Let's see. The next one is, can you use some grass in your compost?
Oh, yes. Try not to put a whole bag of grass clippings all in at once, because then it will mat down and become that stinky anaerobic smell. If you can put it in and mix it with other material as you're adding it to it, then it will stay aerated a lot better. But yeah, grass clippings work just fine, and really should be about half the pile. One thing I do over the course of the year, I have a large blue spruce out front. And it's been limbed up a little bit. So in the fall, when I pick up the leaves, I mow the leaves up. I stack the leaves on the ground underneath the blue spruce. It's like a giant umbrella during the winter time, and it keeps the leaves kind of there, a little bit shredded. And then so you don't necessarily have to put everything in your compost bin at the, when it's available. I store some of these shredded leaves at a time, and I mix them in with the grass clippings as necessary if I need to.
Okay, how long does it normally take to become usable?
If you're an active composter, and by that I mean turning it, you can maybe get a hot pile and get it going in about 3 months. I would say if you're, and I don't recommend going through all that extra work. It may take a year for the pile to do. The picture of my compost bin, I don't know, it wasn't good to go, it didn't show it well, but the bottom half of the compost bin was composted. The top half was still stuff that I could recognize. So when you can see maybe a little bit in this one. The one on the right is more finished compost. The one on the left is green material on top. If you let it go for a year, the stuff on the bottom will have turned into the compost, and the stuff on the top may still be recognizable. Well, then you scoop the stuff off the top onto the pile next to it. You scoop the finished compost out and use it, and then you take the stuff off of the top of the pile that you just made, put it in the empty bin, and then use the compost at the bottom of the other bin. I'm talking about a 2-bin system that I have, so it's not a fast process, but it happens.
Okay. The next one is, what do you do if you see mice in your compost?
I don't think necessarily you'll probably, is someone seen mice in their compost? They probably have the wrong things in the compost bin to do that. This is, I don't necessarily see mice as the type of, eating, grass clippings or leaves, so they may have the wrong components in the bin if that's attracting mice.
I've actually seen a couple mice, and I only put in vegetables.
Okay.
and plants.
Are they using it as more? They're not using it as a food source. They're using it as a home location then.
Yeah, it might be a home location. I don't see them very often, but every once in a while, and it hasn't been a problem yet. But I just wondered if
Well, do you have a cat, or can you step on them? So other than putting them scooping them up and having them in your wheelbarrow as you're moving it off to where you're going to use it, hopefully they'll scamper off as you're reclaiming the compost, and it won't be a problem. But they're not going to be a problem for the bin. It's just a people nuisance a little bit.
Okay, thanks.
All right, the next one is, can the compost, which is not fully done, be used in flower beds to spread?
Yeah, yes, it could. That's like occasionally I will use the grass clippings I take up with the lawnmower as a mulch between my green peppers or hot peppers. I sprinkle it on the ground a little bit, and so absolutely an acceptable form of mulch, and it will decompose in place where you add it. So don't worry about it. That's absolutely acceptable.
All right. The next one, last summer I'm in Los Angeles, very dry if it matters. I had about a dozen large cockroaches in my house and yard. I wasn't composting. Could it have been my neighbor's compost pile? And if yes, what to do?
I don't know how to answer that question. I suspect that, are we talking about this was happening out in California?
That's what it sounds like, yes.
It sounds like, I don't know what the pest issues are out there. So I would say it's probably not the compost bin causing it. I would say it's because there are probably cockroaches out in the area, just as normal course of, that's a, you know, like we have rabbits here, they may have cockroaches there.
The next question is, I've heard sawdust is not good in compost. Is this true?
Sawdust, you know, shredded newspaper, you know, the shredding that you do of your home tax documents and things like that. No, that's okay. The sawdust would be fine. Burned wood ash is probably not recommended. But if you're going to put sawdust in your compost bin, think of that as a very concentrated version of grass clippings. You would want to mix it in and not have the sawdust pile just as sawdust. Think about how do you get air and oxygen into the middle of that sawdust pile? It's not going to happen, just like you're not going to get air and oxygen in the middle of a exclusively grass. So yes, you could mix it in, but try to mix it a little bit more so that it's not just sawdust. You know, so I could use the sawdust I create in my wood shop out there. If you're cutting things like plastic or other materials in your workshop, don't, you know, make sure it's just normal wood, not treated wood as well. Now
that was actually in one of the comments as well.
Now my bin is a treated wood bin. That's okay, you know, but you wouldn't want to add treated wood as the sawdust from treated wood into the bin, because then that's going into your yard.
And then the next question is, can you put the burnt ashes from paper in?
Yeah, I don't know if you're going to have enough burnt ashes from paper, but you know, again, we don't necessarily recommend ash from fire pits into the compost pile because you never know what else is in there with the ash.
So I think that's the rest of the questions. The others were several comments about kind of what goes in. Grass seed has no weed killer as long as the wood was not treated. And then paper is very treated with chemicals. So,
well, most of the ink that's in newspapers these days is soy ink, so you know that's not a problem. Mm-hmm. But yes, the other comment that you said, I failed to mention grass clippings that you've had pesticide or insecticide on your lawn. The rule of thumb is make sure you mow your lawn 3 times after the herbicide, pesticide was applied. After about 2 or 3 mowings, those chemicals are okay. You know, they're gone from the yard, the clippings, and you can use that. So don't use grass clippings that have had pesticide or herbicide on them until you've mowed your lawn 3 times. That's a good point. I forgot to mention that. I usually do.
All right. Are there any other questions? I'll give people a little bit of time to type if they need to type.
Yeah.
But thank you very much for the presentation. I'll just kind of mutter for a while as we're going on. We can also mute everybody if we want to. Let's see, Can you do that?
Here's my bin, and you can maybe see the top of the right-hand side is fresher material. The stuff on the lower, if you can see through the slat in between, it's darker and more decomposed. You know, you can, so as time happens, it will decompose, and it will be more decomposed on the bottom of the pile than on the top. You may have to scoop the top off of the pile to the side a little bit to get to your finished compost at the bottom of the pile, and then your pile is shorter. So then you add to the top of it from the next year's material.
I did get a couple more questions. So one is about what else can go in, like eggshells or citrus. Is that okay to add?
Eggshells, probably okay. Citrus peels, probably okay. Again, you know, those are organic materials. They're not going to be the things that are going to be, you know, think of what would attract rocky raccoon that you don't want to attract rocky raccoon. You know?
Then one last question about things to add. Moldy fruit.
Yeah, I mean, an old banana peel. You know, again, that's organic. That's what's happening in the forest. Whether it's moldy or decomposed in another way, that's what nature does. It rots. You know, and again, think of composting as, you know, the forest floor is a compost bin that's an inch tall by 100 square miles wide. The forest floor is really a giant compost bin that's very short. You know, and this is what nature does. And by putting it into its enclosed space, it helps it do it in a little more controlled fashion and makes it easier for us to harvest the finished crop.
And one more question. How often should you turn the pile?
No more than once a week. Probably once a month is reasonable. You know, it's manual labor. It's when you've got the energy to do it, you don't have to do it. Don't feel you have to turn the bin regularly if you don't want to. If you can and are willing to do it maybe once a week, you'll recognize after it's gone for a while, you'll do it less frequently because it's really mostly decomposed, and the more decomposed it is, the less frequently you'll turn it. You'll realize that.
And then how often to water?
Frequently. You know, if I can spray a little water on it every day when I'm out there with a hose, or every, you know, a couple of times a week, or even once a week, that's fine. If you can't, it will happen. You know, you know, the forest floor is going to decompose whether it gets rain or not. So it doesn't need the water. The water just helps those organisms do it faster. So it's not really, you know, you don't have to don't overthink the compost bin. It's going to happen whether we want it to or not, and that's what nature does.
And the questions are still coming in. So if you have a roller bin, how often should you turn it?
I guess the answer is often enough that you think you're mixing it and you've given it time to work inside. I wouldn't necessarily try to overturn it. You want the material to actually, you know, decompose a little bit between turnings. If you're constantly turning it, the material isn't going to have a time to have the bacteria do the work. You need to let the bacteria do the work to decompose the material. and you may disrupt that from happening if you turn it too frequently.
Is the small pile, will the small pile get hot enough to kill the weed and other seeds?
For us, even the size of my bin, it may not get hot enough to kill weeds and other seeds. So if you are pulling things, take for example the thistles that I've got in my yard or whatever. They're fine because they don't have seed heads on them yet. You know, if you would pull something that's got, you know, these big tall things with the yellow seed heads that float everywhere, those are the ones you might want to put in a yard waste bag and get rid of through the yard waste. But if you don't have seed heads, then it's going to decompose. You know, you probably don't want to throw a lot of tomatoes in there because the tomato seeds will probably make it through. Try not to put in fruit that, you know, is going to bring seeds to your, you know, garden next year. Again, a tomato seedling sprouting up is not the worst thing that could happen to our garden, but you know where I'm coming from.
And then how can you tell if your compost needs more carbon or nitrogen by looking at it?
Yeah, you really, you know, if it's finished compost and it looks like soil, you've done a good job. If it needs, you know, if it needs more of one or the other, if you've got it, then you try to mix stuff in with that you've got. This time of year, all that's going in my bin is green material. And it's going to compost by itself, even though it's green material. Yes, it will work better if you get a fair mixing of brown and green material, but it doesn't have to be a mix. It can be one or the other. Again, the leaves decompose in the forest when they fall in the fall, even though there's no green material at that time. Right now, the carrots and the beets and the beans and whatnot are just getting added to and the weeds that I pull from the garden are getting added to the pile, and it's just green material. It'll work.
And one last question, weeds without seeds but with roots, are they okay to put in?
Oh, yes. Again, remember, that's where some of the bacteria that is used to start the composting comes from, off of the soil that's on those weed roots. So, and because you're going to eventually reuse it in your own garden, hopefully you're not throwing soil out with the yard waste and the soil isn't leaving your yard, it's staying in your yard. So that's absolutely fine. It's even somewhat encouraged. And if you start a pile and you don't have any weeds with roots that have got you know, soil on them, you might actually mix in a few shovels full of soil to get, you know, that's the compost starter. That you don't have to buy that stuff. You've got it under your feet at the other end of the shovel.
All right. Thanks everybody for your questions. I am actually going to stop the recording. Thank you, Paul. You can stay in while we, if anybody has any questions or wants to say thank you on the way out, we'll kind of unmute people, but I'm going to stop the recording now. But so thank you very much for your presentation.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for asking me. Thank you.